war on drugs has been an utter failure, and I think that we need to rethink and decriminalize our marijuana laws. But I'm not somebody who believes in legalization of marijuana. What I do believe is that we need to rethink how we are operating in the drug wars, and I think that currently we are not doing a good job.
That was then State Senator, monochrome shirt and tie wearing Barack Obama at a debate during his 2004 run for the United States Senate. He was saying there that he was in favor of dialing back the criminalization of marijuana, even though he wasn't in favor of legalizing it entirely. Today, now President Obama's Vice President Joe Biden introduced the Obama administration's pick for drug czar. He is Seattle Police Chief Gil+kerlikowske. What do we know about Mr. Kerlikowske? Well, first and most importantly, we know that he is not the same guy as the last guy to have this job. The drug czar under George W. Bush was John Walters, who famously in 2003 said that arguments in favor of the medically prescribed use of marijuana make no more sense than arguments for, quote, medical crack, end quote. Because marijuana and crack, those are exactly the same thing. Although the Drug Policy Alliance, which favors decriminalization, has said that they lament the fact that the president has chosen a police chief to be drug czar, as police chiefs go, Chief Kerlikowske is well regarded on the issue. The Associated Press today citing Seattle drug reform activists calling him smart and reasonable. For example, in 2003, Kerlikowske noted that arresting people for possessing marijuana for personal use was not an arrest priority for the Seattle Police Department. Last fall, he gave his blessing to a pilot program in drug-plagued Seattle neighborhoods for officers to send users to treatment or job centers instead of to jail. If he is confirmed, Chief Kerlikowske will also find that the drug czar job is no longer a part of the cabinet. That job was moved up to cabinet level under George W. Bush. It will be moved back down under Barack Obama. One other thing you should know about could-be drug czar Gil+kerlikowske. Did you ever see the really good Steven Soderbergh, Michael Douglas, Benicio del Toro movie Traffic? You remember that Michael Douglas was the drug czar? And that's this really important plot point that he learns that his daughter has a really serious drug problem. And it ends up with him giving up the drug czar job. Anyway, in Life Imitates Art news, at least for the beginning of the movie, it seems that Chief Kerlikowske's stepson has a pretty considerable arrest record on drug-related charges. Joining us now is Bruce+Mirken, Director of Communications for the Marijuana Policy Project. Bruce, thanks very much for joining us tonight.
Well, thanks for having me, Rachel. Good to be here.
Do you think that there should be a drug czar? and if there is going to be one, is Gil+kerlikowske a good choice?
Well, I think, frankly, a lot of us wonder if there should be a drug czar, and in the best of all possible worlds, we'd probably like to see it be a public health person. But that said, I think there's reason for cautious optimism here. Mr. Kerlikowske is a guy who comes from a town, Seattle, that has instituted some significant reforms. For example, making arrest for personal marijuana possession the lowest priority for local law enforcement. And while he hasn't been one of the folks pushing for these reforms, he has not been mindlessly obstructionist, and I think by most accounts he's a guy that you can have a rational dialogue with. That was absolutely not the case under George Bush's drug czar, John Walters, who was frankly a pitchfork-wielding fanatic, an absolute zealot, particularly on marijuana, who had no interest in facts, no interest in data, and frankly was perfectly happy to lie about what the research says in service of his ideology.
Well, we saw the results of that when everybody in America stopped smoking pot during the Bush era. So, I'm just kidding. Bruce, given what you know of Barack Obama's history on this issue and how he has behaved as president thus far, just in terms of how he does politics, what do you expect him to do differently on the drug issue other than this appointment?
Well, I don't think we're going to see sudden radical departures, but I think we can see a beginning of rationality. He's already talked about dialing back the Drug Enforcement Administration's raids on medical marijuana patients and providers in states where it's legal. We've seen that reaffirmed recently by the Attorney General. And, you know, we're talking about a guy here who keeps saying that we should base policy on data, on research. We should put science ahead of ideology. And if he does that, it opens up the possibility for dialogue on a lot of things, certainly on medical marijuana. The data is here. We know that this relieves certain kinds of pain, nausea, side effects of drugs that used to treat AIDS and cancer. And we should just stop being irrational about it and deal with the science, and maybe we can begin to do that.
Bruce, beyond the medical marijuana issue, on the full legalization argument, some folks are starting to make an economic argument that the economic stimulus that booze sales and booze taxes contributed at the end of Prohibition might be duplicated now with the end of the prohibition on marijuana, that it could actually be some sort of economic boon in terms of its taxation and regulation. Do you think that's a useful argument?
Well, I think it's a true argument, first of all. I mean, the cost of prohibition in terms of both law enforcement expenses and lost tax revenue is estimated somewhere between $10 and $40 billion. That's not pocket change. But, you know, there's another side to the economic argument, too. Our current laws are funding these horrific Mexican drug gangs that have started a real war on our southern border. 60% of their income, according to Mexican officials, comes from marijuana. If we treated marijuana like we treat our wine industry here in California, brought it out of the shadows, regulated and taxed it, we could cut off 60% of the income to these horrific gangs.
Bruce+Mirken, Director of Communications for the Marijuana Policy Project, a man who's very effective at his job. Bruce, it's nice to see you. Thanks for your time tonight.
Thank you, Rachel.
Coming up on